Hey, I'm Dr. Mark Kovacs, excited to be talking about the pathway to the top 100 in the world. So we're looking at what does it take to become a professional tennis player. And we've been working on this project for over a decade now, and it's really just analyzing objective metrics to what players do to achieve Grand Slam success. And we've got a few various components that we look at from rankings, which is the most objective and the most reliable from a standpoint of how it's equal among all players. So rankings don't lie most of the time. Then we're also looking at match counts. We're looking at how many tournaments do they play, what's their win-loss ratios, things like that. So really objective, easy to determine, and easy to relate across different players, different backgrounds, different countries, etc. So you can sort of see here what the purpose is. Majority of this data was at the end of the 2019 season. The reason we use that cut point, that was the last full season before COVID hit and the schedules and the rankings and everything got messed up. So it's really hard the last 2 or 3 years to really utilize that data because people didn't travel, people only played local, people played a reduced schedule. The points structure at the top of the game was different. So there's a lot of confounding variables that makes the most recent data not as valuable. So this information is accurate. It provides us with real clear take homes about what we should be expecting of our players at certain ages through the junior development pathway. So we were able to do this across the ATP and WTA data to look at athletes as they progress. And I'm going to be providing a lot of data in small snippets that hopefully gets you thinking about your players, your progress, and are you monitoring where your players should be at different levels? And also, are your expectations about what's required realistic? I think this was probably the biggest take home for many of the top coaches in the world that I've been working with, that sometimes they didn't fully realize they had some good players, but they didn't have great players, meaning that their players were doing well nationally. They were some of the top in the countries in their respective countries, but they really weren't on a pathway to a top 100 or definitely not to a top 50 or top 25 player. So we have to understand that to be the best in the world is a lot harder than most people think and requires some consistent results. We don't really see diamonds in the rough in the tennis world. Every great tennis player showed themselves at a relatively young age. They may not have been the best in their country, but they were in the mix. They were playing at a high level, they were competing, they were playing a relatively full schedule, and they were known as a really good tennis player. They didn't just appear at 16 or 17 or 18 and jumped on the scene. So let's take a look at some ATP Tour data. So at the end of 2019, we had 62 new players who were in the end of year rankings in the top 100 compared to when we did this analysis in 2014. So in a 5-year period, you had 62 new players. That's quite a lot. We know that there's give or take 8 to 10 new players a year that break into the top 100, but over the course of a 5-year period, you get about 60 or so players that are different than 5 years earlier. So there is obviously a lot of rotation. The top players usually stay there. The rankings are set up that way that if you do well in 2 big tournaments a year, your ranking's going to hold relatively well. So it's definitely top heavy in how the rankings are done on purpose. So you keep the better players at the top of the game for longer. But it's just something interesting to be aware of. Age is always interesting. This was still when Federer, Nadal, Djokovic were in that top 10. So it skews that a little bit. We know it's got a little bit younger with some of the young guys like Holger Rune and Alcaraz and a couple others making it up there pretty quickly. So this age has dropped a little in the last year or two, but we get a sense that, people, once they get there, they stay there, the good players. And this just gives you a framework from an age standpoint, because a lot of people are interested in age and height as well. So height, tall is a value no doubt about it. How tall is always the argument. What's the optimum height? It is shifting up. Used to be 6'1" to 6'2" was considered a great height. Now it's 6'3" to 6'4" is really where a lot of the players are falling, and we've also got the 6'6s, 6'8s, and even close to 7 feet individuals. This is probably one of the more impactful slides. It talks about where are these players when they hit certain ranking benchmarks. We used top 1,000, the first time they broke into the top 1,000. And we did that because there was some data out there that's very good that used first point. And realistically, we looked at a lot of players that got sort of unrealistic first points, meaning they got a wild card and had an easy draw and got lucky and won one match. Or, there was a scenario where, the person they played got sick and really, got an opportunity to win a match that they probably weren't at the level of winning. So we thought the top 1,000 ranking cut point meant that they had won a few points, they'd won a couple matches at a higher level, they've done well in a couple futures, they had really shown themselves to be at that level. So we can kind of see here that the blue line is the top 10 projected pathway of players that made the top 10. Where were they at these different age ranking benchmarks? Top 25 was the orange, the gray was top 50, and the yellow was top 100. And as we see early on in their career, they're pretty bunched up, pretty tight. So it's hard to predict at that stage. Once they get to the top 500, you start seeing a little bit of separation, but it's only 6 months separation. So it's not really just significantly obvious. You really start getting the breakaway when they get to 300 and 200. You start seeing a bit more of a break. And then top 100, we get nearly a year and a half differential from that standpoint. A top 10 player and a top 25 player gets there a little sooner than someone in the top 100, which makes sense. There's less of them. They have a more pronounced, a quicker pathway from 500 to inside the top 100. So we know that a lot of players get stuck at 150, 200, 300, 400 range. Is that because they don't have the ability? They just may have maxed out their potential, their ceiling? Is it because they don't have the resources to have the physio, have the strength coach, have the high quality transition coach who's really good at working on the right things during that period? Is it because they get distracted at that level when they hang around the wrong types of players that aren't as professional, players that go out too much, players that are just not really fully committed to being the best they can be? And if you get stuck in that crowd, it's really hard, even if that player is professional in nature, wants to do it. It's all about who do you hang out with and who do you associate with. So this is a really important area, that transition period towards the top 100. But again, this gives us some good information to get a sense of where they need to be. And this is in the men's data. Semifinals or better, we spent a lot of time looking at this. Reason being is it tells us in general that they're at that level. I mean, if you can make a semifinals of a tournament, that usually tells us that the player has enough skills to compete. It could be the futures, it could be a challenger, it could be a 250 event on the Pro Tour. If you can make a semifinals, it usually means you're a pretty good tennis player at that level, and it's a really good cut point to allow us to analyze how a player is progressing. Winning one match isn't telling us a lot. There's a lot of factors that go into winning one match. Winning 3 or 4 or 5 matches in a week is a real sign that the player has some significant ability at that level and can put it together multiple matches in a row. So as you can see here, we're looking at when did they make their first Futures semifinal? When did they make their first Challengers semifinal? When did they make their first 250 on the ATP Tour? First 500, first 1,000 or Master Series, and then first Grand Slam. And as you can see, it's pretty consistent based on the top 10 players got there a little bit sooner. The top 100 players got there a little bit later, the ones that never made it to the top 10. So you can see that there is definitely a different pathway and a different timeline for a top 100 player than a top 25 or a top 10 player. And this is what we would expect. You can sort of see that the Grand Slam semifinals are the phenoms, are the best ever, the best in the worlds. They get there pretty much similar, if not quicker, than getting to a 500 or 1,000. And, that's skewed a little bit by Nadal, for example. What he did at the French was phenomenal. So it's understanding where some of this data you can maybe see that certain outliers in the top of the game can skew the data a little bit, but it still gives you a really good trend and a really good framework to know that the best in the world are a little bit different. I think everyone knows that. It's how do you use this information to better help you progress your athletes and know where they should be. So futures, where are they? Age of the first futures match. When do they play their first match? It's usually in their 15th year, some of them in their 16th year. So if they're not playing futures by that time point, they're already delayed. Their development's a little bit delayed. Doesn't mean they can't make it. It just means that the vast majority of players historically have been playing futures events at 15 and 16. They usually get their first win sometime in that 16th year. They make their first semi-final in the 17th year. So all of them have. So they've made a semi-final of the futures, and they've won their first futures, which some players never win a futures because they make a few semis, they get their ranking up, they move into a challenger. But we're also very interested, and me personally, very interested in seeing players that know how to win their last match of a tournament. Because if you're trying to develop great players for the future, we know that ranking points and prize money nearly doubles on that last match. So the winner versus the runner-up. So you can have a great tournament, lose in the final, and make nearly half as much money and half as many points as someone who plays the exact same number of matches as you, but they just win one more of them. So really, really important to evaluate your players and how well do they do on Sunday? How well do they do at the last match of the tournament? So here we're doing same evaluation at the challenger level, and really, really interesting info here. So you're looking at, 17th year pretty much is when they play their first challengers. Mid 17s is when the good players, the great players, win their first challenger match. Mid 18s, so you nearly see about a year difference between the really top of the world players and then a good top 100 player. So you see about a year difference there. When they, make their first semi-final, that's again about another year's difference. So we're seeing a clear separation here between a top 10 level player and a top 100 level player. And then we really start seeing a breakaway when they win their first challenger. We're getting upwards of, a year and a half to 2 years potentially. So this is pretty clear that we start seeing a big separation at the challenger level. And the coaches that are out there traveling at this level usually know this, but it's still surprising when you put exact ages to it and you look at the totality of it. We all know outliers skew some of this. There's always an outlier that you can point to, but we don't typically make recommendations on outliers. We evaluate outliers and make sure we're aware of them when we adjust our programming. But if someone's 2 years behind this timeline, they're not on the pathway. It's the language that I use. I'm like, we're not on that pathway to top 100 success. So you may have a good player, they're top 10 nationally as a junior, they're doing really well, they're hitting a lot of other positive improvements, technically, tactically, physically. They're just not winning. They're just not winning enough. And at some point, especially later in their career, meaning 16 and over, you have to start winning. And that happens. And you got to be realistic about when and how that happens. Junior ITF rankings used to be a really valuable tool when nearly all the great juniors, except a couple here and there, would play a pretty full ITF junior schedule. Now the ITF junior rankings are really challenging because a lot of players don't play a full schedule. They only play enough to get into the Grand Slams. Some don't play them at all. So you got to be a little careful just using the historical ITF junior data to make your decisions. As you can see here, there is a bit of a separation. Top 25 players have a nearly half that average level of ITF junior ranking. And again, don't get confused with this, because we have some skewness to this data, because certain players such as a Nadal or a Berrettini didn't play a huge ITF junior schedule, which kind of shifts the average for those groups. There's a lot of data on this slide. I don't really want you to analyze it in too much detail. I just wanted to show you the trends. The trends are what we're looking at, is how do players trend over that junior development period. And most of this is post-puberty. It's 15 and 16 and over for the guys. So we know when they're younger than that, there's a lot more variables. Physically, are they developed? Is their training time equivalent? Because if a 12-year-old spends 20 hours a week hitting tennis balls, and another 12-year-old spends 10 hours a week hitting tennis balls, but plays 3 other sports, they're going to have a different tennis base. But that at 15 and 16, they may catch up. So that's why a lot of this data is really valuable once we start getting into this age period. You can kind of see here at the bottom, the career ITF junior rankings, the highs. You're either having a top 10 type ITF junior ranking if you're one of these top players, or you're not playing ITF juniors really. You're already bypassing them. So you can kind of see examples of Berrettini or Nadal not having a very high ITF junior ranking, but the rest of them pretty much having a really high ITF junior ranking. College tennis, it's always a big discussion in the US. I know other countries, it's less of a discussion. This data has been relatively consistent on the guys' side. There are some different players now if we took this data from this year, but in general, we sort of see the same type of info. We get anywhere from about 4 to 8% of the top 100 have gone to college, and that's been pretty consistent over the last decade. It's really small numbers, and it's usually 1% of the top 50. It's usually one player. Cam Noy is an example. You may get two at any one time. You may get Cam Noy and John Isner, for example, at the same time, but in general, it's pretty low. So it's important to recognize what the data is. It's definitely a pathway. It's definitely a very valuable pathway, especially for late maturers, people that were not on that top 10 or top 25 pathway that we just talked about. College tennis is a great opportunity to physically develop, mentally develop, get a lot of matches, get great facilities, some really good coaching, and then the opportunity financially also now to make a little money, save a little money that you can then utilize for your first year on tour. So great option, but know the realities of the data that we're talking about. So over about a 5-year period, we saw a bit of a different age issue here. Age got a little bit older for the top 10 because that was skewed by Federer, Nadal staying in there so long, and some of these older guys doing really well, based on what we talked about earlier with how the rankings are set up and how great the players are. But then we also didn't really see a difference in the top 100 average age, so it didn't really change. So the top of the game changed because the older guys were able to stay there longer due to greater resources, smarter training, better support staff that was traveling with them, putting money into their body, putting money into their schedule, putting money into their nutrition, all the things where having more money makes a big difference if you use it right, hiring the best people in the world, those type of things. So something to think about from that standpoint. This is just a snapshot of max counts because a lot of people are interested. We spent a lot of time on ratios, max counts. How do you set up a pro level schedule so that one, you're getting enough matches, but two, you're not overdoing your max counts. We see a lot of players that overdo max counts, and we see it every single year. People keep winning, so they keep playing. And that's great at the time because you're confident, you feel good, but the best have to realize that you just can't keep playing even if you're winning a lot. That feels good because you're getting that high of winning and you feel great. But from a body standpoint and a mind standpoint, you just can't keep doing that in an unstructured, non-systematic way because something will happen. The athlete will get injured, or they'll get an illness, or they'll get mental burnout. All three of those can set you back months, where if you were sharp and smart with your scheduling, you would actually pull back, have a couple lighter weeks, and then be able to continue that cycle. So you can sort of see here, most of these players had a relatively similar number of tournaments. The top players played less events because they can. If you're late, the rest of them are in the mid-20s. So you're playing, in the mid-20s at the highest level of the game. So we have to be smart about what that is. That's one, averaging one tournament every 2 weeks, let's say. So if you're talking to your junior players, 2 tournaments a month on average is a good recommendation. If you're doing a lot more than that, that's probably not enough time for full development, because you need weeks of training. You need weeks to be really tired. You need weeks to work on technical adjustments. You need download weeks and even a month here or there where you're doing no events. So that's important. Win-loss ratio, the best in the world are at a 4. 4 matches or so to every loss. So what you're winning, 4-1. That's unrealistic for most people. A 2-1 or a 3-1 win-loss is what we like to see for the best players. If you're only winning a 1-1 or a 1.5-1, you're not winning enough matches. And at the young development ages, winning matches is everything. Doesn't mean that you only play weaker events. You got to play up a little bit, obviously, to get that experience. But too many people play up. Too many people play up when they're not good enough. Too many people don't win enough matches and say, well, we're not worried about winning and losing, which is true. You aren't worried about that. Shouldn't be the focus, but you have to be winning a lot of matches. I mean, historically, the best players win more than everyone else, juniors and the pros. So you have to make sure that you're realistic about it. So this is some interesting data that can help with that. Highest ITF junior rankings, just looking at averages and medians, which takes out that extreme outlier, which is valuable sometimes to look at. And you can sort of see the top 10 average of 45 is completely different than the median, which is 6.5. So if you take out one outlier, it shifts everything. So really important. We use the median a lot when we're looking at ITF rankings, because we want to make sure that we're really looking at an accurate sample, and there's always a few outliers here that skew it. So really, really valuable to look at it through that lens. Age when they played their first ITF event, junior, an ITF Grand Slam event. And you can sort of see this. The blue is the first ITF, and the red is the first ITF Grand Slam. And you can see the age. It's younger than most people think. And this is really important for coaches out there, player ID folks, people that are scouting, people that are trying to predict the future. It's usually 2 years younger than what a lot of the parents think, a lot of the coaches at the community level may think, but the high performance elite coaches know this, that they're really good, really young, meaning that they're competitive at 15, at 16. That's when they are really emphasizing the ITF juniors and playing at a super high level. If you're planning on doing it at 18, doesn't mean you won't make a top 10 level or a top 50 level, but it just means you're about a year and a half behind. So this information is super valuable, because we looked at when did and how many matches did these groups play? Meaning, if you were a top 10 player, if you look back at their career, at what age and how many ITF junior tournaments were they playing? So you can sort of see here that the top 10 players averaged about 33 matches at 15 in the ITF junior level. They actually maxed their ITF junior schedule at 15. And 16 was still pretty high, 29. But then they really dropped off at 17, and hardly any of them at 18 were even playing. They were top 100 in the world already kind of level. So important to recognize. You look at the top 100, you sort of see that the age was about a year to a year and a half difference in where they did their max schedule in the ITF junior level. So this slide is really valuable from an education standpoint to just understand where the players are at these different ages and how are your players tracking. If your focus is, hey, I want them to be playing junior slams at 18, that's 2 to 3 years behind a lot of the top players. So it's really, really important to recognize this. On the guys' side, it's usually 1.5 to 2.5 years behind. If your last year 18s is when you're planning on playing your heaviest junior schedule. On the girls' side, it's 2.5 to 3.5 years earlier. So it's really important to recognize that. So this is just another thing to look at some of the top players' case study examples. So we go through and we look at their trajectories. When did they break top 1,000? When did they break top 100? And how did they kind of work through that? You can see there's a range here from, Nadal, for example, at 15.5. And by the time he was 16.5, he was there. He had the quickest trajectory, obviously. Whereas you've got some others that took a little bit longer, So from that standpoint, David Ferrer started at 18 because if you know his story, he basically stopped playing tennis for a couple of years or a year or two. He really, wasn't playing. And then, he made a rapid ascent from where he started. He just started a couple of years late because he wasn't playing professional tennis at all. But in general, we usually say from top 1,000 to top 100, we're looking at 2 years. If you haven't made that jump from top 1,000 to top 100 in 2 years, doesn't mean you won't. I mean, there's plenty of players that have made it in 3 years, 4 years. They battle through, but it just means that you're missing something. You're missing physical skills. You're missing mental skills. Your schedule was possibly poor. But in general, all the top players are pretty much on a 2-year cycle here. If you look at all these players, they average out at around 2 years. Some start a year later where they break the top 1,000, but they still are approximately on a 2-year cycle. So really valuable to recognize that, and especially the coaches and the administrators that are involved in planning schedules, working with the right players, funding the right player that has the right ability. You've got to use this type of information to make those decisions. So age versus ranking milestones, you can kind of see this in a table of some good players. So really easy to see that what we just talked about in numbers form. So this was just a secondary look at what we just looked at there. And this was something we do with all the players that we work with as well, is sort of compare them to the best. See, how does your tournament schedule match up? So you can see on the left, that's their year, their birth year. They were 14 years old, is the first column there that we see. 14, 15, 16, 17 shows you their year and what events they're playing and how many matches they play at these different events. So at 15, Roger played, 18 singles that he won. He lost 9, played 12 doubles matches, lost 9. This was at ITF junior tournaments. When he was doing, we looked at qualies as well back then. We don't look at as much as qualies anymore, but it's just looking at max counts. The goal is also trying to get full max counts of tournaments played, matches played, things like that. Yeah, and you can kind of see in this example where the heaviest schedule was. Looking at satellites at that time, because he was still in that time when there was a couple satellites left. Futures, challenges, ATP Tour events, total wins, total losses, what was the winning percentage? And you can see the winning percentage, even at his lowest ages, was still in the 60s. 60% win ratio, and then it would go up to 70%. And then his first full year on tour after, he dipped a bit to 0.52, so 50% or so win-loss ratio. Then it went up to nearly 70% for the next couple of years. And then he started getting the 80s and 90s when he was just unbeatable. So really interesting to see the best in the world, what they did and how your players compare. And then also looking at max counts. Max counts vary, but you have to put into account all the matches played. So you can kind of see 100 plus matches is pretty common for, a Federer. Junior players, we usually talk about 100 to 120 matches a year is a really good range. Competitive matches, that doesn't include sort of practice sets and things like that. That's actually formal matches. Now, that's something that's on the line. It's either ranking points, prize money, things like that. There's something that makes that stress of a real match mean something. So let's transition now to WTA data. So similar numbers here, about the same type of turnover that we have at the top 100 level from a 5-year period. So very similar to the guys' data. Average age, a bit younger, a couple years younger. So something that we would probably expect just by knowing how early a lot of the female players retire compared to the guys. So that makes some sense, even though they get on tour a little bit earlier most of the time. They do retire earlier, most of them. This is a very clean data set here, meaning that it's pretty clear when you look at these trajectories, there's an obvious difference. Top 10 player in the world on the female side shows themselves from day one. So when they first break through the top 1,000, they break through the top 500 in less than a year. Then they break in the top 300 in less than half a year. Then they break from 300 to 200 happens in one tournament, two tournaments sometimes. So players go from top 500 to top 100 in 2 years or less. So we sort of see this environment and we see it clearly delineated between the top players in the world compared to the top 100 players in the world. So there's a different timeline. We got to be aware of it. We got to understand it. And we got to know that the best in the world are a little bit different. Most people know it. Most people can see it, especially on the women's side. It's a little bit easier to see it earlier because of physical maturation, because of the ability to, really dominate without the power being the driving force. Better defense, better movement, better mental skills, things like that. So really, really interesting data to see here. Age at first WTA matches. So this is a timeline here of first $10,000 tournament all the way up to first Grand Slam match and match win. Always like to look at match wins as well, because playing a match is one thing. You get a wild card, you get lucky, something happens, but you're just looking at this from an age standpoint. So, but you want to see when they first win a match. It's pretty valuable. And then we also have a lot of data on semifinals and things like that. But you can sort of see trend is pretty consistent. The blue line, the top 10 players are always doing things at a younger level. So they're a bit better earlier. And that's something that needs to be kept in mind when we're evaluating, where do we expect our players to be? Semifinals, kind of similar trends here. You get a couple blips in the road at that $75,000 to $100,000 event. Reason being is a lot of the players jump levels then. So we looked at this in quite a lot of detail. And actually, for a few years when I was involved in setting tournament structure for the country, the goal was to structure the tournament schedules for the country based on the need and cost as well, return on investment, things like that. We know that, do well at the 50s shows that you can play at that level. Then you can jump to 100, 125, even 150, 200 level tournament because there's not a lot of difference there. So understanding where this happens can be valuable for structure as well. Junior ITF rankings. It was interesting to see here that all your best juniors on the female side typically played ITF juniors. It was a big part of their schedule. The main reason was due to the WTA age eligibility rules. So folks that aren't familiar with that, that was put in. It was really called the Jennifer Capriati rule. It was brought in that long ago. And the goal was to minimize the amount of professional tournaments a young female could play. So it's stratified each year from the age of 13. They can only play a certain number of tournaments. It increases each year. When they're 14, they can play a certain number. When they're 15, they can play a few more. 16, they can play more. And then by the time they get to 17, they can start getting into a fuller schedule than a full WTA schedule. So the players know that they can only play so many tournaments at 15 at the pro level. So they play a higher ITF junior schedule. So age, again, about 7 months different, both at the top 10 and top 100 level. So they're a bit older, and we saw that at both the highest level and then also at the top 100 level. Again, something to keep in mind that players are just getting a little bit older, but again, this data can be affected by a handful of players staying there earlier or players retiring a little bit earlier as well. Again, similar data on match counts, how many matches are being played. Most of these players are playing in the range of 80 matches a year, somewhere in that ballpark, on the women's side. So we're seeing that. We're seeing their win-loss situations. So it gives you a snapshot of these players. You can see their ages there. And it's just valuable to sort of take a look at what are the best players in the world doing. What were their highest ITF junior rankings? Pretty much all of them were top 10, or they didn't play it. So it's pretty interesting to see that from that perspective. And that gives you a sense of you kind of, if you're going to be playing ITF juniors and you want to be the best in the world, you sort of need to be in the top 10, even top 5 ITF junior rankings realistically to say, hey, I'm competitive at this level against the best in the world. Here's some data here on Simona Halep, just like we did with Roger Federer, looking at different ages, what tournaments were being played. You can sort of see at 14, there was, a lot of match wins at the ITF junior level, really dominating at that level, and then playing 3, 4, 5 WTA tour events. At 15, winning, playing at a higher ITF junior level, obviously, and then having a split schedule. Still more on the ITF junior level because you have to, but then at 16, the schedule is about split, about the same number. That's the major year for Simona at the ITF junior level. And then she stopped playing ITF juniors after 16. That was her play all the slams, try to win the slams, but also play a close to full WTA schedule at the same time. And then at 17, fully transitioned 100% on the Pro Tour. So hopefully this information gives you a quick snapshot about what it takes to make it to the top 100 in the world and higher, which is a real big important component of it. And then I know we went through this rather quick. There's a link here that you can go to that will actually go into this in more detail. We've got this up. It's sort of like a article. You can sort of scroll through it, look at these graphs in more detail, spend some time analyzing it. You're really taking a look through here, and you can sort of see there's a couple videos on it talking through some of the stuff we discussed. There's some more stuff in here. So hopefully this information can sort of have you thinking a little bit more about where your players are at. Are they playing the right schedule? Are their match counts about right? Are they winning and losing at the right ratio? And are they really being realistic? And are the parents being realistic? And are the people around them understanding what it truly takes to be great? So thank you so much. Feel free to reach out if I can answer any more questions. Look forward to keeping in touch with everyone as well. This is a really